A simple woman named Grace Bennett stepped into the $5,000 a plate Hawthorne Gala wearing nothing but a plain beige dress, light makeup, and shoes so modest you'd think she stumbled in from a public library instead of Boston's most exclusive ballroom. Within minutes, she was surrounded by whispered insults, mocking laughter, and a humiliation so cruel it would have broken anyone else. But just 10 minutes later, her silent dignity would unveil a truth so staggering that the entire ballroom draped in silk and diamonds would be left gasping in stunned silence. Stay with me. This is a story you absolutely need to hear. Before we dive into what happened, comment below and let us know where in the world are you watching from today. And if you believe true grace needs no gold, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. It was just an ordinary evening or so, they thought. The Hawthorne ballroom shimmered like a jewel, every surface polished to a blinding gleam. Crystal chandeliers rained light down onto tuxedos so sharp they could cut glass and gowns that dripped in designer labels. Waiters floated by carrying trays of champagne that cost more per flute than most families spent on groceries for a week. This was the apex of Boston's elite CEOs, heiresses, hedge fund wolves, and socialites born with platinum spoons in their mouths. It wasn't a party. It was a coronation of power disguised as philanthropy. And then Grace walked in. No red carpet fanfare, no entourage, no camera flashes seeking her out. Just the soft, lonely click of her sensible heels against the marble floor, a sound swallowed almost instantly by the collective intake of breath from the glittering crowd. Heads swiveled. Whispered conversations faltered mid-sentence. A ripple of something colder than judgment swept the room as her presence registered a beige blob in a sea of shimmering jewels and silk. Three women peeled themselves from the crowd like sharks scenting blood. Lillian Harper, with her ice-blonde hair coiled high and a crimson dress hugging her like a second skin, led the charge. Beside her, Margaret Voss gleamed in silver sequins, and Evelyn Grant's dark curls bounced with every predatory step. They didn't approach out of kindness. Their smiles were the kind you might see on lions circling a wounded gazelle. "Oh, honey," Lillian crooned loudly enough for nearby guests to hear her tone dripping saccharine poison. "Did you get lost on your way to the temp agency?" A spatter of cruel laughter bloomed from a nearby knot of tuxedoed men. Grace didn't flinch. She merely offered a small, polite smile and continued walking. But the blood was in the water now. Margaret leaned in closer, her voice carrying an unmistakable note of mockery. "Seriously, who let her in? This isn't a thrift store fundraiser." Evelyn wagged a manicured hand lazily at Grace's dress and clucked, "Discount rack chic. Embarrassing yourself at a $5,000 a plate event. Bold move." Their laughter crackled loud and cutting, drawing more eyes, more smirks. The room began to buzz, tiny electric filaments of disdain connecting one guest to another like a cruel network of whispers. Grace adjusted the strap of her simple, clutchless dress, her hazel eyes calm, refusing to let the venom pierce her, but Lillian wasn't finished. As Grace moved past the dessert table, Lillian accidentally tipped a tray of chocolate truffles, sending them cascading onto the floor and squarely into Grace's path. Sticky, rich, brown stains splattered across her beige dress and simple flats. "Oops," Lillian chirped, mock horror twisting her face into a grotesque caricature of innocence. "Thought you want something sweet to match your cheap look." A roar of laughter erupted. Men clinked their glasses, some doubling over with glee. Margaret smirked cruelly. "Now she's a walking stain, perfect." While Evelyn clapped her hands like a delighted child. "Should have worn bib, sweetie." Grace bent to wipe the chocolate from her hem, her hands steady even as their glee rang loud in her ears. Inside her chest, a tightness bloomed, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing it. Humiliation licked up her spine like a slow, cruel flame. She turned and headed toward the bar, seeking a momentary refuge. But the women followed relentless. Lillian leaned toward a passing couple and stage whispered, "Look at her pretending she belongs." The couple tittered behind raised hands. Margaret, emboldened, added louder, "I bet she's here to beg for scraps. Someone tell her the kitchen's hiring." Another dagger, another burst of laughter. At the bar, Grace barely had time to order a glass of water before Margaret snatched it from her hand and dumped it unceremoniously down the front of her dress. The cold shock stole her breath, and a collective gasp swept the crowd. "There, now you're refreshed," Margaret sneered. "Perfect," Lillian cackled. "Wet rags suit her." Evelyn snapped a photo with her phone, crowing, "Gala's trash highlight of the year." as more phones began discreetly lifting to capture the spectacle. Grace stood there dripping her dress clinging to her frame. Her hazel eyes were calm but shining with unshed tears. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. She didn't flee. She simply asked the bartender in a voice so even it sliced through the shrill laughter for another glass of water. Her dignity unbroken stood taller than the glittering heels around her. Earlier that very morning, while the socialites still lounged in silk sheets, Grace had been at Boston General's pediatric wing, sitting by the beds of terminally ill children. One in particular, Lily Carter, a tiny 7-year-old with a bald head and the biggest blue eyes, had squeezed Grace's hand and whispered about her dream, a garden full of butterflies she could see from her hospital window. Butterflies mean hope, Lily had said, and Grace had promised. Right there on the sterile linoleum, she had vowed it would happen. That vow was the reason she was here tonight. Not the champagne, not the silk, not the approval of people who measured worth in gemstones. But they didn't know that. And so the vultures continued. Evelyn grabbed a napkin scrawled charity case across it in lurid red lipstick and slapped it against Grace's damp chest. The room howled with laughter. "Wear your title-proud darling," Evelyn crowed. Paul, a hedge fund darling with an overinflated ego, plucked a $10 bill from his wallet and flung it at Grace's feet. "Here's your tip, sweetheart," he jeered. "Buy yourself a real dress." Another avalanche of laughter. Another stamp, another humiliation. Still Grace Bent picked up the bill and handed it to a passing waiter, with the same poise as if she were passing a check for $10,000. Inside her memories swirled the IV drips. The smell of antiseptic, the night spent wondering if she would live to see her 13th birthday. She had survived worse than this. They didn't know it yet, but they would. In less than 10 minutes, the entire ballroom, the entire city's elite would discover just who Grace Bennett truly was, and their laughter would turn to silence, their smirks to shame, because sometimes the quietest woman in the room carries the loudest legacy. Grace moved away from the bar with the slow, deliberate steps of someone walking through a battlefield, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that sometimes dignity meant refusing to run. Every pair of eyes tracked her movement, now some dripping with mockery, others alight with cruel fascination, waiting for the simple woman in the stained beige dress to finally crumble. But Grace didn't crumble. She simply made her way to a small corner of the ballroom behind a sweeping velvet curtain that shielded her from the worst of the stares, though not from the whispers that continued to ripple through the opulent space. She set her glass down, her hands steady, her spine unbent. Across the room, Lily and Margaret, Evelyn, and their cluster of sycophants had regrouped, emboldened by the spectacle they had made of her. Their laughter, though lower now, still stung like tiny barbs thrown in Grace's direction. Lillian sipped her champagne with the self-satisfied air of a conqueror, surveying her spoils, her crimson dress catching the light like a flare. Margaret tossed her silver gown's train dramatically over one arm as she leaned in to whisper something to Evelyn, who let out a shrill giggle and pointed not discreetly toward the dark corner where Grace had sought refuge. Paul and his hedge fund buddies were no better. They had begun a game at the bar. How many charity cases could they spot in the room? One pointed to the old violinist tuning up by the stage, another to a heavy-set man in a cheap suit near the exits. The cruelty was casual, thoughtless, effortless. None of them saw the auctioneer stepping up to the golden podium yet. None of them noticed Doc. Alan Foster, the hospital's director, smoothing his lapels and preparing his notes for an announcement that would make the air inside the Hawthorne ballroom heavier than lead. Grace, standing quietly in her corner, did notice. She noticed everything. The way the auction catalogs fluttered like nervous birds in trembling hands. The way a few of the more astute guests, board members, old money patrons, began glancing around as if sensing a shift. A change coming they couldn't name yet, but could feel in the fine hairs lifting at the backs of their necks. But Lily and Margaret, Evelyn, they were still laughing. The auctioneer rapped the golden gavel once, twice, thrice. A hush fell. The champagne flute stilled. The whispered barbs dissolved into a brittle, expectant silence. Even Lillian paused mid-mocking glance, her gaze flicking curiously toward the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer intoned, his voice rich and commanding, "thank you for your incredible generosity tonight. But before we continue, Dr. Alan Foster has a special announcement regarding the future of Boston, General's pediatric wing." Grace closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the words settle inside her like a prayer. She thought of Lily Carter, of all the other children whose faces blurred together in her memory, Small, pale hands clutching IV poles. Shy smiles breaking through pain. She opened her eyes again just as Dr. Foster reached the microphone. Tonight, he said their goal was simple: to secure the future for Boston's sickest children. The new wing, he explained, would feature state-of-the-art treatment rooms, an outdoor butterfly garden visible from every bed, therapy spaces filled with light and hope. A haven, he called it, a place where no child would ever feel abandoned to their pain. There was polite applause, lukewarm, restrained. After all, this was standard gala speech fare, worthy but expected. Then Dr. Foster smiled in that way only a man delivering a bombshell can smile, small, knowing, almost gentle. "I am honored," he said, voice dropping slightly, forcing the room to lean closer to announce that tonight, thanks to a single extraordinary donation, the entire Lily's Butterfly Haven project has been fully funded. The ripple of murmurs swelled immediately. A single donor. Full funding. The cost was staggering, well over $25 million by conservative estimates. Heads twisted. Guests exchanged sharp glances, recalculating in real time who among them had the means and the motive to make such a gift. Paul muttered something about old man Hawthorne himself coming back from the grave. Evelyn swore softly under her breath and began smoothing her dress, ready to turn her smile in whatever direction the benefactor appeared. Lillian's eyes narrowed to predatory slits. She was calculating, recalibrating her social alliances, already reaching for new leverage. Foster lifted a hand, calling for calm. At the donor's request, he continued, "The new wing will bear the name Lily's Butterfly Haven, in honor of one brave little girl who inspired an act of incredible kindness. And now I would like to invite that donor to join me on stage." Mrs. Grace Bennett. The silence that followed was not mere quiet. It was a full rupture, a vacuum sucking every ounce of air and pretense from the ballroom. Dozens of heads swiveled in unison toward the plain woman standing near the velvet curtain. The woman with the chocolate-stained dress and water-darkened shoes, the woman some had mocked and humiliated without a second thought. Grace didn't flinch under the weight of their stares. She didn't stumble or flee. She stepped forward with the same steady grace she had carried all night, the whisper of her simple dress against the marble floor, the only sound until scattered gasps filled the room like tiny explosions. Every step she took shattered an illusion. The illusion that worth could be measured in silk or diamonds. The illusion that kindness wore a designer label. The illusion that humility equaled insignificance. At the base of the stage, Dr. Foster extended his hand to her with genuine warmth. She took it, ascending the steps slowly, the crowd frozen as if carved from ice. She faced them not with pride, not with vengeance, but with the quiet, invincible certainty of someone who knows exactly who she is. She leaned into the microphone, her voice clear, soft, carrying to every gilded corner of the vast room. "I was 12 when I became a patient at Boston General," she said, her eyes sweeping across the stunned crowd. "I survived cancer because of the people who refused to give up on me. Tonight is not about me. It's about the children still fighting, about keeping promises made to little girls who dream of butterflies outside their hospital windows." She paused, allowing the silence to breathe. "That's why I'm here. Not for your dress codes, not for your approval. For them, you could hear a pin drop. You could hear a heartbeat. You could hear a regret, heavy, collective, inescapable, settling like a blanket over the assembled glitterati." In the second row, Lillian's face had gone bone white, her crimson lips parted in horror. Margaret clutched her bejeweled clutch like a shield against reality. Evelyn's phone dangled, forgotten in her hand, the photo she had taken of Grace suddenly burning with shame. From the side of the stage, another figure emerged, Ethan Bennett. Tall, dark-haired, immaculately tailored, and radiating a kind of contained power that made the air thrum around him. Most of the room recognized him instantly, or thought they did. Tech mogul, medical empire heir, one of the richest men on the eastern seaboard. But what they hadn't known, what they realized only now, was that he wasn't merely attending the gala. He was here for her. Ethan crossed the stage without hesitation, his hand brushing Grace's in a simple gesture of solidarity, more powerful than any speech. His gaze swept the ballroom with an intensity that stripped away the last tatters of scorn, still clinging to the stunned faces. "My wife," Ethan said, his voice low but ringing with quiet steel, "is the heart behind every gift our foundation has made. She doesn't need diamonds to shine." The truth hit like a tidal wave. Grace Bennett wasn't just a guest. She wasn't just a donor. She was wealthier than any of them, more powerful than the sum of all their designer gowns and six-figure auction bids combined. And she had walked into their world humbly, without armor, without banners, offering only her hope and her promise. The first burst of applause came tentatively, almost unsure, then another and another, until the room erupted, not in polite gala clapping, but in a standing ovation so fierce it shook the chandeliers. Grace stood quietly in its center, her beige dress stained but radiant, her heart unbowed. And in that moment it was clear. True power isn't loud. It's quiet. It's kind. It's unbreakable. And it had just rewritten every rule of the night. The applause eventually softened, not from lack of enthusiasm, but because people were realizing how utterly foolish they had been. A thick, uncomfortable silence settled over the Hawthorne ballroom. The very walls seemed to absorb the shame radiating from the guests, who had only an hour earlier sneered, laughed, and humiliated the woman now standing as the evening's undeniable beacon of grace. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was something deeper, something bone-deep and unsettling awareness that perhaps everything they believed about status and value had been exposed as hollow. Grace stood at the edge of the stage for a moment longer, offering a small, sincere nod of thanks before stepping down, Ethan's hand briefly steadying her elbow as she descended. His touch was light but grounding, like the quiet strength that had carried her through darker storms than these murmuring socialites could ever imagine, as her heels clicked softly against the marble. Once more, this time, no one laughed, no one dared. The crowd parted for her instinctively, a living tide shifting without command, as if some primal reverence had overtaken them. Even those too proud to applaud moved aside, their eyes cast downward, afraid to meet her steady gaze. Grace did not walk with the arrogance of the newly empowered. She moved as she always had, with dignity, so natural it looked almost fragile, until you realized it was steel wrapped in silk. Lillian Harper, who only an hour earlier had been the undisputed queen of the gala, now stood frozen near the dessert table. Her hand, still clutching the stem of her champagne glass, trembled so violently that the remaining liquid sloshed dangerously close to the rim. Her crimson dress, once a symbol of untouchable status, now seemed garish and desperate under the two bright chandeliers. Margaret Voss, her silver gown sagging slightly at the shoulders, as if even the fabric had given up pretending, clutched her expensive clutch to her chest, like a shield. Evelyn Grant's curls, once buoyant with glee, now seemed limp, framing a face gone pale with the cold slap of recognition. Paul and his pack of hedge fund jackals were no better. The bravado had leaked from them like air from a punctured balloon. Paul tried to muster a laugh, some snide remark to cut the thick tension, but the sound came out weak, strangled, and died quickly, as the men around him subtly edged away, distancing themselves from the sinking ship they had so eagerly boarded earlier. Grace moved toward the tables where her simple beige clutch now rested untouched. As she retrieved it, she noticed, though she did not react, that some of the women who had been most vocal in their mockery were now fumbling at their jewelry, their hair, their dresses, as if by polishing themselves they could erase what had just been laid bare. The evening wore on, the auction continued, but the energy was different now, strained and halting. When a luxury Paris getaway was presented, the bids that came were tentative, thrown out more as obligatory gestures than genuine acts of status flaunting. No one wanted to appear too eager, too desperate to reclaim a social standing that had been so publicly dismantled. Grace found herself approached by several guests in quick succession. A nervous woman in an emerald gown introduced herself breathlessly, gushing thanks for Grace's inspiring generosity. A tall man with salt and pepper hair and a wine-stained tie offered her a firm handshake, murmuring about the importance of real philanthropy. The hospital board chair herself nearly stumbled over her heels in her haste to reach Grace, eager to heap praise and secure a photo op. Grace accepted their words with the same calm she had carried all night. She smiled, she nodded, she thanked them with sincerity, because their gratitude, however late, wasn't what mattered. The children mattered. Lily mattered, the butterfly. Haven mattered. Still, a part of her watched these interactions with a quiet, almost detached sorrow. She wasn't naive. She knew these overtures were not born purely of conscience, but of survival. In this world, reputations were currency, and tonight hers had skyrocketed, while others had plummeted like lead. And yet, amid the empty apologies and frantic networking attempts, something genuine stirred at the edge of the crowd. It was Lillian. She approached alone, her hands empty, her face stripped bare of makeup's illusory bravado. Her steps were hesitant, faltering. It was almost painful to watch someone so skilled in the art of domination now clumsily navigating humility. Grace, Lillian said, her voice brittle, cracking on the edges. She clutched the hem of her crimson dress as if it might anchor her to the earth. I, I owe you an apology. The words hung awkwardly between them, heavier than any insult. Grace looked at her not with malice, not with satisfaction, but with a depth of understanding that made Lillian flinch. If I had told you my name when we met, Grace said, her voice quiet but razor sharp, would it have changed the way you treated me? Lillian opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came, only a flush of shame that crept up her elegant neck and stained her cheeks a furious pink. Grace didn't press further. She didn't need to. She offered Lillian the gentlest nod, a benediction, not a forgiveness, and turned away, leaving the woman who had once laughed at her rooted to the marble like a forgotten statue. Margaret and Evelyn lingered nearby watching. They didn't dare approach. Margaret fidgeted with her clutch until the snap broke, the cheap sound echoing loud in the silence. Evelyn's phone screen was dark, her earlier photos of Grace forgotten, now shameful artifacts of a night that had slipped catastrophically out of their control. As Grace moved toward the side of the ballroom, she caught sight of Ethan waiting near the large double doors. He didn't wave or call out. He simply stood there, patient, steady, the anchor she didn't even realize she needed until she saw him. She crossed the room toward him, the simple movement feeling monumental. Each step was a shedding of humiliation, of pity, of the need for validation. She had never needed their acceptance. She had only needed to keep her promise. When she reached Ethan, he smiled, not the proud chest-thumping smile of a man whose wife had just outclassed an entire city, but the soft, private smile of a man who knew her deepest self and loved her fiercely for it. You were extraordinary, he said quietly, offering her his arm. I was just myself, she murmured back. And for the first time that evening, a laugh, small, real sweet, escaped her. Together they slipped out of the ballroom into the cool night air, leaving behind the glitter and rot, the ruined thrones and broken crowns. Grace paused at the top of the grand staircase, the city stretching out before her in a million pinpricks of light. Boston had always seemed so vast, so intimidating, but tonight it felt somehow smaller, more human. Ethan squeezed her hand. Come on, Lily's waiting to hear how it all went. Grace nodded. Tomorrow would bring more work, real work, the hospital wing to oversee, the gardens to plan, a promise to fulfill, but tonight was a victory. Not because she had revealed her wealth, but because she had reminded a room full of people what real worth looked like. It wasn't wrapped in diamonds, it wasn't auctioned on velvet stages, it was a promise kept. It was a little girl dreaming of butterflies. It was Grace, humble and unstoppable, walking barefoot through a world that often didn't deserve her, and changing it anyway. And somewhere deep inside the ballroom they had left behind, the seeds of change had been planted. Fragile, shaky, but real. Just like butterflies. The morning after the gala, the city of Boston stirred awake under a misty veil. Gray clouds hung low, heavy with unspilled rain, and the streets shivered with a quiet chill. But inside Boston General Hospital's pediatric wing, a very different kind of energy pulsed, a fragile, trembling hope, like the first tremor of spring breaking through winter's final frost. Grace stood in the small hospital elevator, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She still wore no jewelry, no designer brands, just a simple blue dress that brushed her knees and a worn pair of ballet flats that whispered instead of clicked. Beside her, Ethan leaned casually against the wall, a to-go cup of coffee in one hand, his presence a calm, steady orbit around her. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. After the night before, there was something sacred about the silence between them, something filled with the weight of all that had shifted. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. The pediatric wing stretched before them, bright and colorful, despite the dim day outside. Murals of smiling animals frolicked across the walls, and hand-painted butterflies danced above each doorway, a project Grace had quietly commissioned months ago, long before last night's announcement. And waiting at the end of the hallway, bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement, was Lily Carter. Lily's arms flailed the moment she saw Grace, her thin face lighting up in a grin so wide it could have swallowed the sun. Her stuffed bunny dangled from one hand, its floppy ears trailing the floor, and a nurse smiling indulgently held Lily's IV pulse steady as the little girl half-hopped, half-danced in place. You came, Lily squealed, her voice hoarse but joyous. Grace's chest ached with the force of her own smile. She dropped to one knee as Lily hurled herself into her arms, careful of the IV line, but reckless in the way only children who love without limits can be. Of course I came, Grace whispered into Lily's soft bald head, breathing in the faint, sterile, clean scent of the hospital, mixed with the syrupy sweetness of children's soap. I promised, didn't I? You always keep your promises, Lily said, her voice muffled against Grace's shoulder. Ethan watched quietly from a few feet away, his coffee forgotten in his hand, his heart twisting in a way that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with awe. After a moment, Grace pulled back slightly, brushing a stray eyelash from Lily's cheek. Are you ready to see something special? She asked. Lily's eyes grew impossibly wider. She nodded so vigorously her IV line quivered. Taking her hand gently, Grace led Lily and the nurse toward a set of double doors farther down the hall. Beyond them, the future waited. The butterfly haven. The doors swung open with a soft hiss. Lily gasped audibly. Then for a moment, she simply stood frozen, overwhelmed. The garden was not grand in the way of rich men's estates. It was not manicured or sterile. It was alive, wild, exuberant, filled with flowers of every imaginable color. Towering sunflowers stretching toward the sky, vines curling playfully around trellises, clusters of bright wildflowers buzzing with bees. And above it all, dozens of butterflies, real. Butterflies flitted and danced their fragile wings, catching the muted light like stained glass windows in motion. It had taken months of secret planning. The hospital board, once skeptical, had finally relented when Ethan had quietly purchased the neighboring property and donated it to the hospital, providing the necessary space. Specialized enclosures, heating systems, botanical experts, it had been an enormous undertaking. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the way Lily's mouth fell open, the way her small hand tightened in Grace's, the way her entire body trembled with a wonder so pure it shattered every bruised and broken thing inside the adults around her. Grace knelt again, staying at Lily's level. This is yours, she said softly, for you and for every child who needs to remember what hope looks like. Tears filled Lily's enormous blue eyes but did not fall. She was too entranced, too dazzled, too alive. Behind them, other children began to gather. Nurses wheeled out children in beds and wheelchairs, tiny faces peeking out from behind IV poles and oxygen tanks, laughter bubbling up from throats raw with sickness, but not despair. And slowly, hesitantly, parents followed. Doctor staff, even some board members who had attended the gala the night before still wearing their discomfort like ill-fitting suit. Among the crowd was a familiar figure. Lillian Harper. Gone was the crimson dress. Gone were the diamonds. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, now her hair pulled back into a severe ponytail. Her makeup scrubbed down to almost nothing. She carried no designer clutch, no entourage, only a clipboard tucked under one arm, a volunteer badge clipped awkwardly to her chest. She hovered uncertainly at the edge of the garden, watching as Lily spun in place, her stuffed bunny flailing wildly as she tried to track every butterfly. At once, Grace noticed her. Of course she did. For a long moment, their eyes met across the sea of wildflowers and fragile wings. Lillian's shoulders tightened, her chin dropped slightly. She looked like a woman expecting judgment, expecting to be shamed again, and perhaps rightly so. But Grace only offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. A nod that said, I see you trying. And then she turned back to Lily, to the laughter, to the sunlight breaking through the clouds at last. Later that afternoon, as the children were ushered back inside for naps and treatments, Grace found herself standing near one of the butterfly enclosures, watching a monarch struggle free from its chrysalis, its new wings trembling in the damp air. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms loosely around her waist, his chin resting lightly on her shoulder. You did it, he murmured. No, Grace corrected softly. They did it. Lily did it. I just kept my promise. They stood there for a while, letting the world spin around them, content simply to exist in that fragile, powerful moment. And somewhere behind them, unnoticed but not unseen, Lillian knelt beside a wheelchair, helping a tiny boy adjust his oxygen mask with hands that for once were not adorned with rings or bracelets. Margaret Voss, silver gown long since traded for jeans and a hospital t-shirt, was setting up paints at an arts and crafts station nearby. Even Evelyn Grant, curls tied back in a messy bun, was reading aloud to a small cluster of children, her voice soft and unsure but earnest. Change was slow. Change was clumsy, but it was real. Grace watched the newly freed monarch pump its wings once, twice, 3 times before finally lifting into the air, catching a breeze and soaring high above the garden. She smiled. Hope, after all, was a fragile thing, but given just enough space, just enough light, it could fly, and so could they. All of them, the days that followed the opening of Lily's butterfly, Haven moved like slow, golden rivers. Word of what had happened at the gala and what had blossomed at the hospital spread beyond Boston's glittering circles. It made its way into the newspapers, into local television, into the corners of the city that never touched the gala's world. The construction workers reading over coffee, the nurses working double shifts, the single mothers pushing strollers through crowded sidewalks. But more than fame or admiration, it birthed a strange, slow ripple of reflection. It was as if the act of quiet, anonymous generosity had cracked something open inside the city, a wound no one had realized was festering. Grace didn't follow the news stories. She didn't seek interviews. She didn't sit for the photographers now clamoring for a shot of the mystery philanthropist who had humbled Boston's social elite. She returned day after day to the hospital, wearing her simple clothes, tying her hair back in a low, neat knot, and moving from room to room with the same calm, luminous kindness she had carried long before anyone bothered to notice her. She spent her mornings sitting by hospital beds, reading books, painting tiny watercolor butterflies for the children too sick to go outside. She spent her afternoons with Lily, helping her practice walking laps around the butterfly garden, counting each trembling step with bright stickers and louder cheers. And in the evenings, when the sun dipped behind the skyline and the flowers folded their petals against the cooling air, she would sit with Ethan on a stone bench in the garden center, his arm draped around her shoulders, saying little, needing nothing. But even in the peace she built, change kept creeping in. Shy, I'm awkward, unsure. It started with small things. So a new volunteer showed up one morning, a woman in her late 30s wearing a borrowed polo shirt and jeans she clearly wasn't used to. Her name tag read Margaret. She didn't draw attention to herself. She just quietly helped organize a messy art supply cabinet, kneeling on the floor and sorting through glitter glue and half-broken crayons with a concentration so fierce it almost seemed penitential. Later that same day, another woman arrived to read to the children, her curls pulled back into a simple ponytail, her designer handbag conspicuously absent. Evelyn, the nurse whispered to Grace with a note of disbelief. She signed up for story hour. Grace simply nodded as if this had been inevitable all along. But the real surprise came a week later during the monthly hospital board meeting. Grace rarely attended these, preferring to send quiet updates through Dr. Foster. But on this occasion, Foster had insisted, arguing gently, that her presence might be the very catalyst the board needed to push through the final funding approvals for the Haven's long-term expansion. She agreed, albeit reluctantly. The meeting room was a bright, sterile space filled with long, polished tables and the self-important rustling of papers. The hospital's wealthiest patrons were gathered, many of them, the same faces from the gala, men and women who now glanced at Grace with a mix of reverence and guilt. But when the door swung open mid-meeting and Lillian Harper walked in, the room seemed to tilt sideways. She didn't wear crimson. She didn't wear diamond. She wore simple black slacks and a modest blouse. Her hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, no makeup, no entourage, no air of imperious command, only a thin stack of papers in her hand and a determined light in her eyes. Without waiting for permission, Lillian walked to the front of the room, set her papers down, and turned to face the board. I would like to propose, she said, voice steady despite the visible tremor in her hands, that the hospital establishes a permanent family support fund. The room blinked at her. Lillian cleared her throat, pushing forward. A fund, she continued, that will provide financial assistance to the families of pediatric patients, covering cost insurance. Doesn't like transportation, temporary housing, meals, even job support for parents who have to leave work to care for their kids. Murmurs broke out. Whispers flew like startled birds. She raised a hand, silencing them. I'll fund the initial endowment personally, and I'll be hosting a new series of fundraising events, smaller ones, community-based. She glanced just briefly at Grace before adding, events where everyone feels welcome. The board chair blinked, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. It was Dr. Foster who spoke first, his voice rich with something dangerously close to pride. Seconded, he said simply. The vote passed unanimously. Lillian didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply gathered her papers and, after a small, almost imperceptible nod toward Grace, left the room the way she had entered, quiet, focused, changed, louder outside under the hard blue of a late autumn sky. Grace found her standing alone by the hospital's main entrance, staring out at the street as if seeing it for the first time. You didn't have to, Grace said softly, stepping up beside her. I did, Lillian replied without looking at her. Because back then when I laughed at you, she faltered, gathering herself. I wasn't laughing because you were small. I was laughing because you reminded me that I was. Grace didn't answer. She simply stood there shoulder to shoulder with a woman who had once sought to tear her down and now was trying clumsily, imperfectly, to build something better. After a long moment, Lillian let out a shaky breath. Thank you, she whispered. And somehow that felt more honest than any apology ever could. Days turned into weeks. The trees shed their golden leaves. The first cold winds of winter began to slide through the city streets. Life at Boston, General settled into a new rhythm. A rhythm in which hope wasn't something whispered timidly behind closed doors, but something worn openly, proudly like a badge. The Butterfly Haven flourished. New murals appeared inside the hospital, painted not by professionals but by the children themselves. More volunteers trickled in. More families found support when they needed it most, and through it all, Grace remained the same. Simple, steady, unshakable. One evening as the sun sank behind the skyline in a blaze of molten orange, Grace sat once again on the stone bench in the garden center, her head resting against Ethan's shoulder. Across the garden, Lily, Carter now stronger, walking without her IV pole for longer stretches, chased a bright blue butterfly, her laughter pealing through the air like church bells. You changed them, Ethan murmured. Grace shook her head gently. They changed themselves, she said. I just gave them something real to hold on to. He kissed the top of her head, breathing her in. You gave them more than that. She didn't argue, she didn't need to. Because in the end, it was never about revenge. It was never about humiliation returned. It wasn't about power or pride. It was about promises. It was about hope. It was about building a world where a little girl fighting for her life could believe, truly believe that beauty and kindness and light were not luxuries reserved for the lucky few, but birthrights for all. And as the stars winked awake above the city, Grace watched Lily reach out and catch the blue butterfly gently between her small hands, laughing with all the fierce, defiant joy of someone who knew now and forever that hope could fly. And so could she, and so could they all. Winter arrived with a quiet authority, frosting the edges of Boston's narrow streets and turning the Butterfly Haven into a delicate wonderland. Thin sheets of ice glazed the garden's shallow ponds, and the flowers, though stripped of their blooms, stood proud and skeletal against the pale sky. The butterflies had been moved to a special heated conservatory built adjacent to the pediatric wing, a new project Grace had quietly funded long before the first frost. It was a space filled with tropical blooms and warm light, where even in the coldest months, children could walk among colors and life. The hospital itself changed in quieter ways. Donations began to trickle in steadily. Not the showy, tax-sheltering contributions of Gala nights, but smaller, humbler gifts from ordinary people. School bake sales, local shops, anonymous envelopes slid under the hospital door. Volunteers filled every shift. Artists came in to teach painting classes. Musicians played softly in the hallways. The hospital, once a place weighed down by grief and resignation, had become something lighter, a place that fought harder for life, for dignity. Grace moved through these changes with the same steady presence as always. She refused every interview, turned down every profile the newspapers pitched. She avoided cameras whenever she could. Her goal had never been visibility. It had always been the quiet revolution of hearts. One snowy afternoon, Ethan found her sitting in the conservatory, a worn notebook open on her lap. She was sketching out plans for a new project, her brow furrowed in concentration. Around her, children laughed, chasing butterflies that flitted lazily through the humid air. Lily, now strong enough to run short distances without supervision, darted after a brilliant yellow swallowtail, her blue knit cap bouncing. Ethan sat down beside her without a word. For a moment, they simply watched the children play the golden afternoon light, softening everything it touched. You're planning something, Ethan said eventually, his voice low and fond. Grace smiled without looking up from her sketch. Always. He leaned closer, pretending to read over her shoulder. Another garden. A library, she said, tapping her pencil against the page. A special one for the kids who have to stay here long term. Somewhere they can disappear into stories when they need to leave this world for a while. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. You know, he said after a moment, you're building an empire. Grace laughed under her breath, a sound like a soft chime. If it is, she said, it's an empire made of paper wings. He tilted his head, studying her. That's the best kind. She closed the notebook, resting it lightly against her knee. For a while they sat in companionable silence, broken only by the soft whir of wings and the occasional peal of childish laughter. And then very quietly, Grace said, I think it's time. Ethan turned his head slightly. Time for what? She looked at him, then, her hazel eyes steady and clear. Time to tell them. It wasn't a decision she had made lightly. For years, they had kept certain truths private, not out of shame, but out of a desire to protect the purity of their work. Fame corrupted things. Money distorted motives. Grace had always wanted the children to see the gifts they were given, not as charity from on high, but as acts of shared humanity. But now the city was listening. And sometimes when the world leans in, you have to whisper something true into its ear. 2 weeks later, on a crisp Saturday morning, Grace and Ethan stood together in the hospital auditorium. The room was packed. Doctors, nurses, volunteers, board members, even some of the parents and children who had spent too many nights within the hospital's walls. A few journalists were present too, though Grace had made it clear this was not a press event. No cameras, no microphones shoved into faces, just a conversation. Grace stepped up to the small wooden podium. No notes, no prepared speech. I want to tell you a story, she began, her voice carrying easily to the back of the room. The room hushed, the kind of stillness that only descends when everyone senses they are about to be given something precious. When I was 12, Grace said, I spent 9 months at Boston General. I was very sick, too sick sometimes to even hope. But every night when the nurses tucked me in, I would imagine a place just beyond my hospital window, a garden filled with butterflies, bright, alive, free. She paused, letting the image settle over them. I promised myself, she continued, that if I survived, I would build that garden, not just for me, for every child who needed to remember what it felt like to dream beyond their circumstances. A soft murmur swept the room. Sadness, admiration, recognition. I did survive, Grace said simply, and I kept my promise. She glanced back at Ethan, who gave her the smallest, most encouraging nod. But I didn't do it alone, she added, her voice warming. After college, I met Ethan. He believed in the same thing, that kindness shouldn't be rare, that dignity shouldn't depend on wealth. Ethan stepped forward, slightly, his hands folded loosely in front of him. We combined what we had, he said, picking up the thread of her story seamlessly. Our inheritances, our companies, our ideas. We built the Bennett Foundation, not to put our names on buildings, but to quietly invest in places like this. To make sure no one fighting for their life had to also fight for their humanity. The room was utterly still. Now Grace smiled, a small private smile. I never cared about being recognized, she said. I only cared that when a child looked out their window, they saw something that reminded them, you are not forgotten. You are not alone. A nurse sitting near the front wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her scrubs. A father with a toddler perched on his lap bowed his head, clutching the child a little tighter. And now, Ethan said, his voice firm but gentle, we want to do more. He gestured toward the back of the room where a large easel had been covered with a white cloth. A volunteer pulled it away, revealing a simple painted rendering of a new wing, the Bennett Children's Resource Center, a place for therapy, education, counseling, and respite, free to all families, funded entirely by the foundation. The applause that followed wasn't explosive. It wasn't showy. It was real. A rising, roaring wave of gratitude and hope afterward. As the crowd began to disperse, people lined up not to snap photos, but to shake hands, to say thank you, to offer their own stories, their own small promises to be part of whatever came next. Grace stood amid them all, listening, nodding, laughing softly when appropriate. She saw Margaret helping a mother juggle paperwork and a squirming toddler. She saw Evelyn kneeling to tie a little boy's untied sneaker. She even saw Paul, not the smirking hedge fund king, but a man holding the hand of his own daughter, his face quiet with something like humility. Later, when the auditorium was nearly empty, Grace and Ethan stepped outside into the brittle winter sunlight. The city stretched before them, old, flawed, stubbornly beautiful. Ethan reached for her hand. What now? He asked, smiling. Grace squeezed his fingers gently. Now, she said, we build 1,000 gardens. And if it's not enough, he teased lightly. She looked up at him, her face alight with something fierce and endless. Then we build 1,000 more. And hand in hand they walked forward into the bright, blinding cold. Two souls who had once been broken, now whole enough to heal the world. The cold cut through the streets like glass that evening, but Grace hardly noticed. She and Ethan walked slowly, their footprints side by side in the thin dusting of snow. The world around them softened to a hush. They could have called for the car, could have wrapped themselves in the warm leather cocoon of their driver's waiting vehicle. But tonight, neither of them wanted barriers between themselves and the city. They had quietly been changing piece by fragile piece. They walked past shuttered bakeries and coffee shops, glowing gold from within past bundled families, laughing their way home, past the silent statues that guarded the corners of the public gardens. It was a rare thing, Grace thought, to feel so full and so hollow at the same time. Ethan tightened his hand around hers. He had learned to read the subtle shifts in her silence, the way her shoulders dropped when she was tired, the way she tilted her head back slightly when she was thinking too hard. Tonight her steps were heavy with a different kind of weight. You're quiet, he said after a while. Grace smiled, but it was a small, sad thing. There's something I need to tell you, she said, her voice soft enough that it nearly vanished into the night air. Ethan stopped walking. They stood beneath a street lamp, its light pooling around them, a tiny island of brightness in a sea of gathering dark. Anything, he said simply. Grace took a slow breath, her gloved hands tightening around his. For years she had carried the truth quietly like a smooth stone in her pocket, something worn familiar by the passing of time, something she had thought might never need to be named aloud. But she understood now, after all the changes, after all the lives touched and shifted, that true transformation required full honesty, even when it hurt. I told you, she began carefully, that when I was 12, I was a patient at Boston General. That's true, Ethan nodded, patient listening. But what I never told you, she continued, was that I wasn't there alone. My mother was with me because she was dying. The world seemed to narrow around them. Ethan's hands tightened slightly, not in anger or alarm, but in the kind of fierce protectiveness that came from loving someone enough to want to carry whatever burden they offered. She was sick for a long time, Grace said. Cancer that spread too fast, too deep. We were in the hospital together for months. She was in the adult wing, but sometimes she would sneak into my room at night, dragging her IV pole behind her like it was nothing. She would crawl into my bed and hold me, tell me stories about the garden we would plant when we got out, a garden filled with butterflies. Her voice wavered, but she pushed through it. She never left the hospital, Grace said. She died 2 days before my final treatment. She never saw me ring the survivor's bell. Tears stung Ethan's eyes, but he said nothing, letting her unfurl the grief that had lived inside her for so long. For a long time, Grace said, I hated that garden. I hated the idea of it. It felt like a broken promise, a cruel dream. Every time I tried to imagine it all, I could see was the empty space she left behind. She pulled her hands away, gently wrapping her arms around herself as if warding off more than just the cold. I didn't build the butterfly haven because I had some pure, noble heart, she said. I built it because I was angry, because I wanted to fill the world with something she should have seen, because I wanted to fight back against the emptiness. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and steady. Grace, he said, what you built isn't anger. It's hope. Maybe it was born from pain, but look what you made of it. She shook her head, a single tear escaping, despite her best efforts. I needed you to know, she said. I needed you to see me, all of me. Ethan reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the wetness gently. I see you, he said. I always have. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of him anchor her to the moment. For so long, she had feared that revealing her broken places would somehow diminish what they had built together. But standing here under the sharp winter stars, she realized that it was those fractures, the scars left by love and loss, that made her work, not just necessary but sacred. They walked on slower now, their steps measured not by the cold or the distance, but by the steady unspooling of shared truth between them. A few blocks later, they found themselves standing in front of the small public library where Grace used to spend hours as a child, long before the sickness, long before the grief. The building was dark now, closed for the night, but its windows glowed faintly from the streetlights, casting long, soft shadows across the sidewalk. Grace stared at it, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. My mother used to take me here, she said quietly. We didn't have Meyer, but she said stories were free gardens. You could live 1,000 lives and never leave the city. Ethan followed her gaze to the worn brick facade, the carved stone lions standing sentinel at the entrance. Is that why you want to build the library at the hospital? He asked. Grace nodded. Every child deserves 1,000 gardens, 1,000 lives to imagine, even if the one they're living is hard. He took her hand again, squeezing it tightly. Then we'll build it, he said, not because we owe it to them, but because they deserve it. The promise hung between them, solid and golden, as real as the snow beginning to fall in soft, fat flakes around them. Later at home, as they curled together on the worn leather couch, Grace told Ethan stories about her mother, about the way she used to dance clumsily in their tiny kitchen, the way she could never sing on key but did anyway, the way she had believed fiercely in small kindnesses, changing the world. Ethan listened, his hand drawing slow circles over Grace's back, anchoring her to the present, while honoring the ghost she carried. And somewhere between the stories and the silence, Grace realized that healing didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean erasing the pain. It meant carrying it forward in ways that made the world gentler for someone else. It meant building gardens where none had existed before. It meant living so fully that the empty spaces left behind by loss bloomed into something breathtaking. Outside the window, the snow thickened, blanketing the city in hush and hope. And in the quiet warmth of their living room, Grace finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the gardens she had planted were enough, and that maybe, just maybe, her mother could see them after all. The first true thaw of spring came late that year, slow and stubborn. For weeks the ground remained hard, the trees bare the sky, a heavy slate above Boston's skyline. But on a soft morning in early April, something shifted. The wind lost its bite. The trees shivered with the early promises of green. And outside Boston General Hospital, the first daffodils pierced the tired ground with bright, defiant color. Inside the hospital's conservatory, the butterfly haven bloomed back to life. The air was thick with warmth and the faint hum of bees among the blossoms. Dozens of butterflies, delicate and wild, filled the space with flashes of impossible color. Children wandered among them, small hands reaching toward wonder. Grace stood near the entrance, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her heart strangely unsteady. Today was special, but it was threaded with a bittersweet ache that even the fresh spring air couldn't entirely dissolve. Lily Carter was waiting by the far fountain, sitting in her wheelchair with a bright pink blanket draped over her knees. She had grown thinner over the winter, her cheeks a little hollower, her energy a little softer around the edges. But her smile, when it came, was undiminished, a fierce, beautiful thing. Grace crossed the room, slowly weaving through the other children and their families, catching snippets of laughter and soft murmured conversations. She paused briefly to lift a toddler who had tumbled to the ground, setting her back on her feet with a wink before continuing toward Lily. Hey, Butterfly, Grace said, crouching down beside the wheelchair. Lily giggled, the sound bright but breathless. Hey, Grace. For a few moments, they simply sat together, watching the butterflies dance above them. You know, Lily said, her voice low and confidential, they're all waiting for you. Grace frowned slightly. Who? Lily grinned, her small fingers gesturing toward the far corner of the conservatory where a makeshift stage had been set up. A cluster of nurses, doctors, parents, and volunteers were gathered, whispering and shifting expectantly. They're doing the dedication, Lily said, as if Grace should have known. Grace blinked. She hadn't planned a speech. She hadn't even wanted a ceremony. She had envisioned a quiet plaque, maybe a few words written somewhere small and discreet. She hated the spotlight, hated the way it stripped away the quiet work and turned it into a spectacle. But as she looked into Lily's wide, shining eyes, she realized that this wasn't about her discomfort. It was about giving a moment to the children, giving them something beautiful to celebrate. So she stood, smoothing the soft fabric of her pale green dress, and made her way toward the stage. The applause rose gently as she climbed the few steps and turned to face the crowd. She searched the sea of faces. Ethan's steady smile, Dr. Foster's kind eyes, the mischievous grins of a dozen children hiding behind their nurses' skirts, and felt something in her chest loosen. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, soft and expectant, like the pause before the first note of a favorite song. When I was a little girl, she began, her voice steady. I used to dream about a garden. She told them briefly about the window she used to stare out of, about the invisible gardens she had painted in her mind when the pain became too much to bear. She spoke of the promises made between mother and daughter, of the stories whispered in the dark. But life, she said, her voice catching slightly, doesn't always unfold the way we hope. She glanced down at Lily, whose small hands were folded neatly in her lap, her bunny clutched close to her chest. But sometimes, Grace continued, her smile breaking through, if you hold on tight enough to your dreams, if you carry them through the broken places, sometimes they grow into something even more beautiful than you imagined. She gestured around the conservatory, the blooms, the butterflies, the laughter threading through the air like music. This garden, she said, isn't mine, it's yours. It belongs to every child who needs to believe in something bigger than their pain. Every family who needs to know they're not alone. She paused, letting the weight of it settle. And every time a butterfly takes flight here, I hope it reminds you that even when everything feels heavy, even when you think you can't go any further, there is beauty waiting on the other side of the struggle. There is hope. A ripple of emotion passed through the crowd. Parents wiped their eyes. Nurses held each other's hands. Children stared wide-eyed, understanding in ways far deeper than their years. And Grace added, her voice softening into something almost secret. When you see a butterfly, know that someone is cheering for you always. She stepped back then, letting the applause wash over her. Not as a storm, but as a gentle tide. She didn't soak it in greedily. She let it touch her lightly, then flow past, and our Foster took the stage next, unveiling a small bronze plaque set into the conservatory's stone wall. Grace's name was not engraved there, only the words, for the dreamers, the fighters, and those who never let go. Grace stood back, letting the children surge forward to touch the plaque, to laugh and point at their reflection, distorted in the shiny surface. Later, as the conservatory emptied and the lights softened into the golden haze of late afternoon, Grace returned to Lily's side. You were amazing, so, Lily said, her voice thin but fierce. You too, Grace whispered, brushing a strand of fine hair from Lily's forehead. They sat in silence for a while, watching the butterflies lazily circle above them. Then Lily said so quietly, Grace almost missed it. I'm tired, Grace. Grace swallowed hard. She knew they all knew. Lily's body was beginning to surrender despite her spirit's fierce defiance. Grace reached out and took her hand, holding it tightly. You can rest, she said, her voice breaking. It's okay. Lily smiled small, sure, and closed her eyes. The next morning, Lily Carter passed away quietly in her sleep, her stuffed bunny tucked under one arm, a paper butterfly taped carefully to the headboard above her. The hospital mourned. The city mourned, but Grace celebrated, because Lily hadn't just fought. She had lived, she had loved, she had seen her garden, her dream made real, and she had left behind something no death could ever erase. A few days later, under a bright, cloudless sky, the hospital held a small ceremony, and the Butterfly Haven children released dozens of real butterflies into the air, their wings catching the sunlight in blinding, beautiful flashes. Grace stood among them, head tilted back, watching as the sky filled with color. And in that moment, she understood something she had only ever grasped at before. Healing wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about building something sacred from it. Love wasn't about avoiding loss. It was about giving it freely, wildly, beautifully, even knowing it might end. And hope. Hope wasn't a fragile thing after all. It was the strongest force in the world. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the flutter of wings against her skin, and smiled. Somewhere, somehow, her mother was smiling too. And Lily, wild and free, was chasing butterflies in gardens that would never fade.